Imagine this. You're at home in Jerusalem or in Nazareth with your family, maybe making a living as a shepherd or a farmer, maybe even as a tax collector for the Roman emperor. Life is good, or at least okay. Or maybe life's pretty bad. But you've heard about this guy, this man who is telling everyone that things can be different. Apparently, he's been telling people that God can change everything. And something about the rumors you've heard makes you want to go and see him personally. You want to hear this message for yourself. The problem, of course, is that he's far away, somewhere in the wilderness. But you're determined. You gather up your clothes and you pack some food, or maybe not. Maybe you just head right out the door. And you leave that village that you've known so well for your whole life. And heading east, you walk 20 or 30 miles until you hit the running waters of the Jordan River. And then you follow the river, navigating the rocky terrain and the heavily wooded areas, until finally, maybe hours, maybe days or weeks later, you hear something. A single voice rises up, cutting through the silence. Shortly after, it's followed by a whole chorus of voices. And then the sounds of splashing water as people dip below the surface. As you walk through the thick brush towards the commotion, you see the man that you've heard so much about, John the Baptist. And at first, his appearance is a real shock. He's really disheveled, and he looks like he's wearing what could be camel hair. His ribs are sticking out, and his arms and his legs look like sticks on his gaunt frame that's only nourished by honey. But you have faith. This is the man you've been told about. And finally, he's going to tell you that it's all going to be all right. Now, the first few times I read today's reading, I got this really laid-back vibe from John the Baptist. Look, he's saying, every valley should be filled, and every mountain and hill will be made low. It came off as very, don't worry, be happy to me. I had this real picture of John hanging out in the wilderness, maybe wearing dreadlocks, kind of hanging back singing, baby, don't worry about a thing, 'cause every little thing gonna be alright. If I can go off on a little tangent here for a second. A lot of the commentaries and translations that I've read are very careful to refer to John as John the Baptizer. And I think this is really, really funny. It's like they don't want to confuse us, and they don't want to make the Methodists jealous that John has been added to the Baptist church. Like next we're going to expect to hear about Matthew the Presbyterian, Andrew the Congregationalist. Although, honestly, with the description of John hanging out in the woods and eating honey and wearing fur, I could kind of see him as part of the UCC.
Amen.
John the Baptist is preaching the good news that Jesus is on his way. Now, earlier in Luke's Gospel, we learned that Jesus and John are actually cousins, that John is 6 months older than Jesus. One story tells us that their mothers, Mary and Elizabeth, met up while they were both pregnant. But beyond that, I'm not really sure that John and Jesus knew each other when they were growing up. And now here is John standing in the river, preaching about someone coming to save Israel. Even bigger than that, someone who will show all flesh everyone, God's salvation. And I'm not sure that John knew specifically that who he was talking about was his cousin, Jesus. But it's clear that John did know that God was going to be known in some real way in the very near future. At the time, John was preaching to a community being oppressed by a corrupt empire, a nation struggling to find its way. And he promises that God will make things easier. God will take care of them. Just wait, John seems to say, for what's coming. It's just around the corner. For John's listeners, there must have been a real sense that something big was on its way. Of course, on our end of the story, we know that John was preparing the way for Jesus' ministry. But the listeners who traveled out to that uninhabited land had no idea what to expect. And this fact that John was announcing the coming of Jesus is, of course, one of the reasons that we use it during Advent. But it's not the only reason. I think we can all relate to this feeling of waiting and anticipation. And this is the message of the Advent season. The weeks leading up to Christmas help to create this feeling of expectation. For many of us, this year has been a year of concern, maybe even fear. In our uncertain world, we live with worries about where our next paycheck will come from, or if it will be enough to meet our family's needs. At a time when every nation of the world seems to be involved in some sort of conflict or war, and when even the political dialogue in our own country seems to be frothing with hatred and brutality, fear is a very real emotion. And so we pause to remember John's message to his audience. We look back in history to hear John and Isaiah tell us it's okay. God is going to take care of you. But that's not all that the prophets were saying. They're telling us that we all have a part to play. God is going to help, but only if we're willing to help bring about a radical change. The images that Luke quotes from Isaiah of valleys being filled and hills being flattened illustrate the tremendous changes that were about to come, are to come to this world. But these changes aren't all God's doing. John called his listeners and us into a new relationship with God. For John's audience, it was no longer about simply being born into one certain religious background. Nothing was going to get handed to them just because of their ethnicity. Instead, John invites them to forge this new bond with their Creator by repenting their sins and to symbolize their new life with God through a ritual cleansing with water. Sounds simple, right? You just talk about what you've been done and you take a bath, and then everything's going to get better. Well, of course, there's a lot more involved. And for John's followers, they had to make a hard decision with even just their first step. Even before they could hear what he had to say, they had to leave their home and start on a journey that was maybe long and unfamiliar and difficult. They had to seek out John in the wilderness. The wilderness in the Bible is a pretty fascinating place. In today's modern industrialized world,